From early contact with European and American populations, the Shawnees were exposed to and engaged in Western education. This history is complicated by the frequent, voluntary, and forced migrations of the Shawnees in response to the influx of trading and settler communities. Shawnee ancestors, such as Kinafiase Jackson, recalled migrating to live near Cape Girardeau during the early 19th century. By 1817, a mission school had been established in this area by Chief Lewis Rogers, an adopted son of Chief Blackfish. The school, run by Baptist minister John Peck, enrolled both Indian and non-Indian children. Christian mission schools played a central role in early education efforts. Ohio mission schools were established for the purpose of educating Shawnee children on 3 reserves: Hog Creek, Wapakoneta, and Lewistown. From 1808 to the 1830s, Quakers established and ran mission schools in this area. The missionizing impulse to educate the Indian grew with the passage of the Civilization Fund, created by Congress in 1819, and schools received financial assistance from the U.S. government. By 1824, there were 32 schools serving 916 students. Schools introduced to children the habits and arts of civilization. The government believed they could change the culture in 1 generation. The passage of the Indian Removal Act, the Indian peoples remaining in Ohio were relocated to various locales in Indian Territory. From 1830s to 1856, Quakers, Methodists, and Baptists established missions in northern Indian Territory, present-day Kansas. A number of Eastern Shawnee surnames appear in the record of the Methodist Mission in Kansas, the largest of the 3 mission schools in the area. These names include By 1836, Baptist minister Isaac McCoy observed that between 1 to 200 of the Shawnees, Delaware, and Potawatomis were capable of reading, and some could write. He lamented that literate Shawnees had begun teaching their kinsmen. For McCoy, this was a problem because the literate Shawnees did not have the knowledge of the missionaries. Clearly, the Christian missionaries' literacy was not the primary objectives. Natives who broke all ties to Indian culture was the goal. In contrast to northern Indian Territory, to the south in what is now Ottawa County, Oklahoma, federal officials struggled to establish schools among the mixed band of Shawnees and Senecas. In a series of the annual report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Indian agents noted a resistance to education from the mixed band. The mixed band refused teachers and opposed education, and in 1852 the agent noted, they adhere to many of the ancient customs and partake of as few of the habits and manners of white people as possible. By the beginning of the Civil War, Indian Territory had been reduced to the size of present-day Oklahoma. Tribes such as the Shawnee, who previously settled in northern Indian Territory, were moved south. The government questioned the effectiveness of the civilization projects of the mission schools. It was clear the goal of removing all vestiges of Indian culture in a generation had failed. By the end of the Civil War, the experience of Native Americans had changed dramatically. Territories were dramatically reduced, and government surveillance was increased. By 1879, it was clear that mission schools were not working. The problem was that the children were not sufficiently removed from the cultural influences of their tribe. The formation of Carlisle Industrial School in 1879 signaled a new approach to the education of Native children. By 1880, there were 60 schools serving 6,200 children. This new policy allowed the government to play a stronger role in Native American education and began what is commonly referred to as the boarding school era. This educational era is important because it involved the removal of children, such as the Shawnee, from their communities. The government believed that this separation would make it easier to break the bond between Native traditions and the children. It was not until 1972, almost a full century later, that the government finally passed the Indian Education Act, establishing what would focus on educational needs of American Indians from a Native perspective. During the 100-year span, more than 150 boarding schools were in operation, and hundreds of thousands of Indian children received their education through this program. For many of the children, the boarding school experience was traumatic because of forced assimilation. Numerous children were removed from their homes, particularly after the passage of the Compulsory Education Act in 1893. In some instances, parents were coerced or tricked into sending their children to the schools. Oftentimes, children stayed at the boarding school for years without seeing their families or returning to their communities. Upon arrival at the boarding school, children were given uniforms, English names, and had their long hair cut off. There was an English-only policy, a major component of forced assimilation. Living conditions were very poor for the students due to the lack of funds and health personnel. Food was insufficient. Dormitories were overcrowded. Work was extremely taxing, and there was no disease prevention. Overcrowded conditions made it hard for the youth to stay clean and healthy. They shared towels, beds, toothbrushes. Toilets didn't function correctly, and they were only allowed to bathe once a week. The diseases that took the most lives were tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and pneumonia. Most boarding schools were run in a militaristic fashion. The system divided students into different companies to break up tribal groupings and any resistance to school rules. The strict, authoritarian environment restricted students' creativity and individuality. The main curriculum of the boarding schools consisted of industrial training for half of the day and basic academic education the other. The industrial training for the boys included blacksmithing, shoemaking, or farming, all skills already outdated at the time. The girls learned how to cook, clean, sew, and do laundry. Their academic education entailed the basics: how to speak, read, and write in English. Religion and patriotism played major roles in the boarding schools. It was believed that Christianization provided children with important ethics, and patriotism developed in them a love for the flag and country. Many of the children came from diverse religious backgrounds, including Christianity. Religious instruction on campus, chapel, service attendance was mandatory. Students were expected to become patriotic American citizens, and the schools celebrated all national holidays. It must be acknowledged that some families and children wanted to go to the schools, although some youth were prohibited from a boarding school education because their blood quantum did not meet the minimum required 1/4 degree Indian blood. Families hoped a good education could further their children's social, economic, and political advancement. A number of boarding school alumni did go on to become teachers, government employees, leaders in their tribe, and many served the military. Many Shawnees are examples of resilience and success. There were 4 primary boarding schools that the Shawnees attended: Carlisle, Seneca, Chilocco, and Haskell. In the remainder of this film, we will meet just a few of the Shawnee boarding school alumni. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School was founded in 1879 by retired Civil War Captain Richard Pratt, who coined the well-known phrase, "Kill the Indian and save the man." This school was established in the remnants of an old Pennsylvania Civil War cavalry barracks, and it became the model for Indian boarding schools throughout the country. Pratt's intention was to separate children from their families and communities during the critical developmental years of childhood in order to transform the Indian into the white man's image. His model for education was grounded in strict discipline and included the use of bells, whistles, bugles, military-style punishment, and daily regimen. It remained an institution of learning for 40 years, and approximately 10,000 Indian children were sent there. It closed in 1918 with the onset of an influenza epidemic. Diseases and epidemics were a common part of the boarding school experience, and Carlisle includes a cemetery, where the remains of students who died there are interred. One Shawnee student, Fanny Gibson, the daughter of John Gibson, is listed in the death records. She was 18 when she passed on December 6, 1900. Pratt began his educational experiment by recruiting students from tribes in the northern plains. He convinced the tribal chiefs to entrust their children to Carlisle. In the end, children were bound on trains headed for the school. Upon arrival, students would enter through an archway. It led into the frightening building. The arch was symbolic of the transition of a student going from an uncivilized to civilized space. Once they entered, they were lined up and inspected for health checks. The long hair was cut off, and every student was given a uniform. The school's strict regimen was firmly established, and students from a broad range of tribal communities were in attendance. Students were evaluated in 4 categories: academic, industrial, dormitory, and outings in regards to their skill level and their conduct. In academics, their courses included English, exercise, arithmetic, geography, physiology, hygiene, writing, and drawing. From 1905 to 1918, 19 Shawnee boys attended Carlisle, and from 1905 to 1917, 6 Shawnee girls were enrolled. 2 daughters of Susan Tomahawk, Rosa, and Anna Skulka, Eastern Shawnee, attended Carlisle. Rosa was 19 years old, and her sister was 18 years old when they left Ottawa County, Oklahoma, in 1916 to study at Carlisle. Rosa's descendants, including Dorma Hollis, Robert Cassee, and Chris Samples, have all served as members of the Business Committee, the governing body of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. Carlisle kept records on each student and followed up with them after they left. There are many details that can be learned from this paper trail. For example, absentee Shawnee Casper Alford began attending Carlisle on August 29, 1896. He was 18 at the time, suggesting that his elementary education had taken place elsewhere. Records indicate that each summer he was placed on outing, where he worked on farms in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. On March 21, 1901, Alford was recorded as being on a timeout. But on June 25, 1901, he was readmitted to the boarding school for several weeks. And on July 2, 1901, he left school for government employment. Alford reported that his work with the superintendent did not agree with me, and I had to quit. He began to farm his own allotment and stated that he made a good, independent living. I will not work for no one else but Casper Alford. By 1913, he reported to the school that he was getting along fine and dandy. He owned his own home, farmed 260 acres of land, and had 4 horses, chickens, and a milk cow. 13 years after leaving Carlisle, he still corresponded with a former teacher, catching her up on a little of my doings, including his marriage to a Carlisle gal. Marriages that emerged from the boarding school experience were common. For example, Nancy, Nan Prophet, also attended Carlisle, and she introduced her classmate, Ellen Thomas, to her brother, John Prophet. Ellen and John later married and have many descendants in the Eastern Shawnee tribe. Seneca Indian Boarding School was established in 1872. The Wyandot Tribal Council donated land for the Quakers to operate a boarding school for Seneca, Wyandot, and Shawnee children, and this was approved by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. In 1871, campus construction began, and the school opened for classes in 1872. The federal government continued to assert increasing control over the school, completely managing it by the 20th century. The government should own the land upon which this valuable school plant is located at. When the government purchased the land, the money that was supposed to go to the tribe was instead funneled to the U.S. Treasury. Congress justified this by claiming they would act in the best interest of the tribe. In actuality, the money was used for the United States government's best interest. In the eyes of the United States government, the Seneca Indian School was seen not only as a place of education, but it was also a profitable investment. Students at the school had 6 hours of instruction and 5 hours of labor each day. The curriculum was divided up into units. For example, one of the units Shawnee children participated in during the spring of 1937 involved animal husbandry. The fourth graders were given a hen and had complete control over her and her eggs. They ended up selling a total of 13 eggs to the Employees Club, and proceeds from their sales went towards a picnic in the school park. Another unit involved third graders visiting local grocery stores to learn more about money and how the stores run. They then went back to the school and ran a grocery store, acting as the employees and consumers to gain experience. Dennis was only 4 years old when he went off to Seneca Indian School in Wyandot, Oklahoma with his 2 older sisters, Doris and Betty. He put him in first grade for 2 years because there was no kindergarten class. He stayed at that school for 3 years and finished second grade. The first day the children arrived, James was left alone at the boys' dorm, and soon after, he went off to find his sisters. He didn't understand he did anything wrong by leaving. Once the teachers found him, he got his first whipping with a hickory stick. He was only 4 years old. Every year, Lost Creek, which ran alongside the campus, flooded. One time, Dickie Tiger and Dennis James walked down the stairs to the water and took off in a boat that was tied up there. Once they were gone, folks went looking for them, and when they found them, they were marched into the classroom, had their pant legs rolled up, and were spanked on their calves with a hickory stick in front of their class. The hickory stick, it appears, was a frequently used tool of punishment. Aside from the atrocity of stripping the children of their culture, they were used as free labor to help the government run a profitable school plant. The Seneca Indian School received a great deal of revenue from unpaid child labor, as well as working to destroy Shawnee culture and instilling a Western one. The Shawnee Indian Agricultural School was established in 1884 in north central Oklahoma and remained active for almost a century. There are 2 theories behind the origins of the name of the school. During its time of operation, over 18,000 students circulated through the school. It was constructed and funded by order of the U.S. Congress until it was closed in 1980. After the school closed, the building was used as a rehabilitation center for a decade, and then the land was dispersed among 5 tribes. A distinct characteristic of this boarding school was that it brought in students from multiple tribes from all over the state, including Pawnee, Miami, and Shawnee. It was built to handle 150 children, but at its peak grew to house 900. The Shawnee student body made up a small percentage of students who attended Chilocco. In 1903, there were 49 Shawnee students attending, and this number dropped to 13 by 1910. In 1925, the school added a high school curriculum. Before that year, Shawnee students accounted for only 2% of the student population, but the numbers grew as many Shawnee attended Chilocco after they received their early education at other boarding schools. For example, Dennis James of the Tooley family began his education at the age of 4 at the Seneca Indian School. He transferred to and graduated high school from Chilocco in 1956. He went directly into the United States Marine Corps upon his graduation. During his professional career as a healthcare specialist, he served in Indian Health Services for 20 years. Another Eastern Shawnee, John Peacock of the Blue Jacket family, graduated high school at Chilocco in 1969. After serving as a United States Marine, he began his career in the Indian Service and retired after 30 years. One of the tactics the federal government used to retain students was to bring them in under a 5-year contract. They were not allowed to leave the school. Some did run away. Jim Greenfeather Jr. recalled, "I knew what it was like at Seneca Indian School because I went there during 6th and 7th grades. When my mom passed away in 1954, I quit school. Then they tried to put me in white man schools, and I rebelled. During the 1950s, I went to Chilocco, but I ran away twice before I finally stayed and graduated in 1961. While I was there, I was in the National Guard and played football and baseball. I took academic classes and studied carpentry. When I left Chilocco, I went directly into the Army where I was a paratrooper." While the goal of the school was to educate and assimilate the students into dominant culture, they provided them with a substandard education in case they might surpass those in the majority. The authoritarian figures maintained a level of power over the children almost exclusively in the educational setting. However, it did not carry over into their lives outside of the school, such as their social life. Their social hierarchy was set up according to gender and age, and it was in this realm that the students developed a sense of self-sufficiency by raising themselves and each other. Unlike some boarding schools, Chilocco experienced more covert resistance from the students, rather than outright rebellion. However, the discipline and punishment system was often described as too strict for insignificant acts of disobedience. For example, one girl was locked in a small room for days because she had her hair cut too short. Expressions of tribal identity were either ignored or punished by the teachers. Despite the harsh punishments, the school was still very dependent on the student labor in order to function. The jobs required of the students forced them to develop leadership and self-sufficiency skills. On September 1st, 1884, 12 Ponca boys, 2 Chilocco boys, and 5 girls and 3 boys from the Ottawa Reservation in Kansas arrived at Haskell, which originally served grades 1 through 5. The children were greeted by newly constructed dormitories, a barn, a tool house, a boiler house, a blacksmith shop, and they were expected to accept this as their new home. The first Eastern Shawnee child to attend Haskell in the 1880s was John Prophet. In the years to come, children from over 35 tribes would attend Haskell, making it second to Carlisle in tribal diversity. Students came from many different states. These were the first of many students that would walk through the halls of Haskell. The school used a demerit system, which allowed the students to give demerits to their fellow students. Punishment techniques included a jail system, cutting off their hair, beatings, and deprivation of privileges. The jail was a 3-room guardhouse where students were confined from days to weeks, depending on the severity of their punishment, and they were fed only bread and water during this time. The first semester enrollment increased from 22 to 400 students, but by the end of the year, it had dropped to 260. Many students deserted, writing home about the harsh punishments they faced. After 2 years of operation, Haskell already faced severe funding, health, and reputation problems. The outing program was an important element in children's education until the 1930s. Teenage boys and girls were placed in rural homesteads and middle-class urban households to work as farmhands and domestic servants. This program prevented children from returning to their tribal communities when school was not in session. Admitted students were compelled to stay for a minimum of 4 years. Many students didn't like Haskell right away, including Lucy Bluejacket, who told her children that she walked in the front door at Haskell and walked straight out the back door to catch a ride back home. Some students appealed to the Indian agent back home for permission to return and visit their families. Their case had to be strong, and they were frequently denied. Boarding school officials at Haskell required pre-approval of an Indian agent or local reservation superintendent before children were given permission to go home. Homesickness was endemic at the school, and for the very young, it was most likely the hardest part of attending there. In 1927, Lucinda, Ira, and Earl Peacock learned this the hard way. They were not allowed to return home for the summer after they had made a written request to go home. Some children ran away from Haskell, including Buck DeWeese. His daughter recalled, "My father, Buck DeWeese, went to school at Haskell. He always told us he didn't have enough to eat there, but the student athletes always ate well." He also said that he often had to work long hours in the gardens, and one rainy day he woke up and ran away from school. He managed to make it all the way home by walking and catching rides. He told us that he started feeling so good once he got to the area around Joplin. After leaving Haskell, he never returned to school. A health inspection in 1908 revealed that 57 students were discharged due to tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and pneumonia claimed the highest death rates at Haskell. Until the 1920s, 120 children were buried at Haskell. The records reveal that this number could be much higher since the school did not record the death of every student. George Evans and Jonah Moriarty, both of other Shawnee communities, are buried there. In many cases, students at Haskell lost relatives at home while they lived away at the boarding school. One Shawnee tribal member, Nina Duchesne, recalled, "My sister Jessie and I were both at Haskell when our 3-year-old sister, Lula May, died. I had been at Haskell and never got to see my little sister. Jessie had only been up there about a year when Lula May died." This was just one case out of hundreds where Haskell students lost relatives without closure. A number of Shawnee students used what they learned from Haskell to help their native communities. The students served as educators and government leaders. Many showed resilience and strength throughout their lives and were outstanding American citizens. Howard Spear Duchesne is one example of a Haskell graduate who went on to achieve great things even though he had faced hardships during his school years. Howard graduated Haskell in the 1940s and served in the Asian Pacific Theater in World War II. After his service in the United States military, he went on to pursue a long career in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Dorma Hollis, another Shawnee member, graduated from Haskell in the spring of 1943. She was one of the first women to serve on the Eastern Shawnee Business Committee. Doris also served as head clerk to the superintendent of Seneca Indian School. Life at Haskell was extremely difficult to get through, and the many years students spent their lives haunted by these memories. But even though they faced such hardships, many were able to leave the boarding school behind and find a better life in the many years following. The purpose of the Carlisle, Seneca, Chilocco, and Haskell boarding schools was to assimilate and educate Native American youth into Western Anglo-American society through the erasure of their tribal and native identity. Native Americans, such as the Shawnee, had mixed and complicated reactions to the boarding school era. The federal government funded various boarding schools and recruited Native American children through coercion and manipulation of their parents. Oftentimes, the children's only means of seeing family again after they arrived at the school was by running away or being expelled. The living conditions were often harsh, the authorities cruel and unforgiving. Despite the school's attempts to completely destroy the students' tribal and native identity, there were some unintended positive effects that stemmed from the structure of the school. For example, the student population consisted of many tribes. This brought them all into contact, which might not have occurred otherwise. As a result, a pan-Indian identity formed among the students. It also reinforced their individual tribal identity, as they found ways to differentiate themselves. So, although the goal of the school was to eliminate these identities, they actually perpetuated them. Right now, the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma is experiencing an immense cultural resurgence as they regain an understanding of their language and culture. They are teaching the younger generations about their own language and cultural traditions, and under their own terms.